Trump-Russia collusion. It was all a fiction that was conjured up by Hillary Clinton, paid for by Clinton. And, Obama and Biden and James Comey and, John Brennan and the whole gang were all in on it. And they used the phony dossier as a pretext to try to destroy Trump and drive him from office. Mueller should have been investigating them. But then, when we found out during his, congressional testimony after his report came out, that he didn't know anything about what had actually happened, the people behind the Russia hoax, it became abundantly clear that this guy was suffering from some sort of diminished mental acuity, and he didn't even know what was in his own report. And, it was sort of sad.
Yeah. Well, that's the new Democratic technique. Find a guy with mental diminishment. You do what you want, put that guy in charge. So, hey, let's get to the Supreme Court. The president attends the oral arguments yesterday, and sure enough, there's all the media saying it was totally inappropriate for him to be there. He was trying to intimidate them. What's the real truth?
Well, that's utter nonsense, because the president was a named party in the litigation, and that automatically makes him eligible to be invited and attend, the oral arguments. I watch, I listen, and you can never watch unless you're there in person. But I listened in to the oral arguments yesterday, and, what struck me is that John Sauer really made a very persuasive, credible argument. He backed it by historical facts. The authors of the 14th Amendment never intended to grant universal citizenship to children of parents who broke the law coming here fraudulently or illegally. But it didn't seem to matter to the justices that those who wrote the 14th Amendment did not mean to include illegal migrants. One of the authors of the amendment stood on the floor of the Senate, David Howard, and said, quote, "This will not include persons born in the U.S. who are foreigners and aliens." Instead of paying attention to that, very logical history lesson, these justices seem skeptical and wary of dramatically altering, a century of government interpretation. Interpretation, by the way, that was horribly mistaken from the outset. So, as I wrote in my column yesterday about the hearing, this may be one of those instances in which a long-established norm and the complexity of reversing it is just too much of an obstacle for a majority of the justices on the court, which is a shame.
Yeah. Hey, this Ketanji Brown Jackson, a bit of a nitwit, if I do say so myself, but listen to this argument she tried to make, which made no sense at all.
If I steal someone's wallet in Japan, the Japanese authorities can arrest me and prosecute me. It's allegiance, meaning can they control you as a matter of law? I can also rely on them if my wallet is stolen to, under Japanese law, go and prosecute the person who has stolen it. So there's this relationship based on, even though I'm a temporary traveler, I'm just on vacation in Japan, I'm still locally owing allegiance in that sense.
Is there any merit to that argument? Should she be on this court?
None whatsoever. And, I wish there had been a camera in the Supreme Court, because I'm pretty certain that a lot of the justices were rolling their eyes and shaking their heads when she uttered that nonsense. I listened to that, and I said to myself, how does she manage to think with that brain of hers? Really confounding. What she did was conflate two, well-known principles of law and politics. There's a difference between territorial jurisdiction and political jurisdiction. She was talking about, with a silly analogy, territorial jurisdiction. You have to follow criminal and civil law wherever you are located in whatever country. But political jurisdiction is allegiance to the United States and no other foreign power. But she doesn't understand, a basic legal concept as if she, slept through law school. And, as far as I'm concerned, she has no business being then, certainly not in the nation's highest court.
Yeah, have we ever had this happen before? We had a bubblehead who just on there for a million years on the Supreme Court?
Well, not in recent modern history, not in my lifetime, but we've had some pretty hideous Supreme Court justices over the last 2.5 centuries, particularly those who authored the Dred Scott opinion, which was one of the greatest, probably the greatest miscarriages of justice ever issued by the U.S. Supreme Court, and a disgrace and a shame.
Yeah. Now, why do we have, I never understood this process. We have the oral hearing, but the oral arguments. We're not going to have a decision until the summer. Why do we have to wait so long?
Well, they go into conference afterwards, after the oral arguments. They usually have a discussion. They may take an initial vote. Then they have to assign it out to whoever is going to write the opinion and, figure out all of that. But there's more that goes on. I think the feeling, as I wrote in my column, is that Trump's going to lose. But that's not a certainty, because behind closed doors, there's a lot of lobbying that goes on among the justices, and in fact among their clerks, who are very active in shaping opinions. And there have been a couple of very famous historical Supreme Court cases in which, the initial vote was like, 7-2 or 8-1, and it completely flipped the other way around because of the conversations and the lobbying that took place. So, you could never really tell.
Interesting. Well, Greg Jarrett, great stuff as always. Everybody go read his columns, foxnews.com, and go to Amazon and order any of Greg Jarrett's books. You'll love them. In fact, one of the best legal books ever, Trial of the Century, and of course the Russia hoax and witch hunt and all the. But anything by Greg Jarrett, just go to Amazon.